Hello, everyone out there. So today is actually a very interesting and unique day because it is the last day of the whole book. So before we get into this chapter, the last chapter, let's look back at the whole book, the Iliad by Homer, which we started way back when. Now it's going to be a quick summary, so just be aware I got to leave some stuff off, else I'm not going to be able to get through all this. So quick. Paris of Troy, way back in the beginning, took off with Helen. But Helen was the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. So what's up with that? But anyways, Paris took off to Troy on a ship. He goes there. Now the Greeks are like, we're not having this. So they sailed off to Troy to get Helen back. Now, the result of all this was 10 years of fighting, like intense fighting. And as you guys know, many were killed, including two of the strongest fighters on each side. So you've got Achilles with the Greeks, who, he had that Achilles heel, that where you can get injured. And then Hector with the Trojans. If you remember, way back, Achilles was dragging Hector around. It's intense. So a lot of death. And then we're right up towards the end now. And what happens is the Greek Odysseus, he decides he's got this idea. Maybe even the gods helped him. Who knows? He came up with a plan to finally just finish this war. Or at least he thinks it's going to finish the war. He creates a wooden horse as a pretend gift to the goddess Athena, and the Trojans are like happy about this. But realistically, inside the horse, there are some fighters, including Odysseus and Diomedes. So we're going to see what's going to happen. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? What's up? And this is it, guys. So let's hop in. The fall of Troy. All day the people rejoice, singing and dancing in the streets, decking their temples in branches of oak and myrtle in readiness for a sacred festival the next day. So they're all pumped up. The Trojans think, man, we won. These guys sailed off. If you remember, most of the Greeks had sailed off. So the Trojans think they're all gone. And when all was done and darkness fell, they went to their own places and lay down to sleep. The Trojans like, oh, we're good now. But then, covered by the quiet darkness before moonrise, the fleet was returning the group of ships from Tenedos as swiftly as the rowers could send their ships through the water. And crouched close in the airless space within the horse's belly, Odysseus and his fellows waited with straining ears and breath in check, while high on the temple wall Sinon strained his eyes seaward for the signal from the high king's ship, to tell him that the fleet was close inshore and the time had come to let out the hidden warriors. And all around, Troy lay quiet in sleep. And I imagine all these people are they're just sleeping on their pillows or whatever they had back then, thinking everything's good. But meanwhile, we've got these people ready to jump out of that horse and slaughter or kill people. At last the signal came, a red blink of fire far over in the darkness out to sea. Sinon's heart stumbled within him, and he began to race. He dropped from the wall and made his way to where the great horse stood, its shape blotted against the sky that was slivering toward moonrise. Standing beneath it, he cried out once like a shorebird, but not quite like a shorebird, to those listening within. So maybe he's like, whatever a shorebird sounds like, I don't know. Then Epeius drew back the pine wood bars, and a trap door fell open in the horse's side. A rope came spooling down from it, and one by one the warriors, Menelaus and Odysseus and Diomedes and all the rest, came dropping to the ground. So now they're outside of the horse. They stole down like armed shadows from the high place to the city gates. They slew the gate guards, so there's some people protecting the gate, and they just killed them, and flung open the broad gates to their fellow Greeks swarming up towards them. So the Greeks are off their ships, and now they're coming through the doors. Then terror came upon sleeping Troy. The dark tide of warriors poured through and became a river of flame. As men kindled torches at the guardhouse, fires, and ran to burn the houses of the city. Men, half waking and half armed, staggered out to meet them and were cut down. Hush, hush. The night was full of screams of women and children. The air grew thick with the sounds of battle, and fire went roaring through the city as it goes through a cornfield when a high wind is blowing. So here's an image of it. Now, if you've ever been in a fire or seen a fire, it moves fast at times. But Odysseus had no part in all this. Indeed, no man had seen him since the war band came out from the horse's belly. Diomedes, with Automedon and a growing band at his heels, had found the king's palace and overcome the guards in the outer court. They were flinging firebrands up onto the roof, so throwing these kind of lit pieces of wood onto the roof to light everything on fire, where defenders were tearing up the heavy-colored roof tiles to hurl down upon them. Guarding their heads under their shields, they charged the main doors with war axes and gilded beams torn from lesser buildings. The door leaves burst open, tearing the bronze sheath hinge posts from their sockets, and the men spilled through into the courts and chambers and colonnades beyond, cutting down the guards who stood against them. No bolts or bars, nor desperate courage of drawn swords could hold them back. They stormed up one passageway and down another until they came at last to an inner court where stood an altar to the gods of the home, with an ancient bay tree bending over it as though to shield it from the fiery sky. So some of you might see like maybe crosses in some homes, or some people are Buddhist and they might have a Buddhist statue. Back in these days, they believed there were all these different gods. So each home might have had some statues to these different gods. So that's when they said that little area with an altar with all those gods. And there the queen and the princesses had gathered, clinging about the twisted trunk like doves that have swooped to shelter from a storm. But there was no refuge for them, so there's no safety. Nor for Priam, the aged king himself, who knelt praying to the gods before the altar. So you can imagine all of them just like, please help us, that type of thing. A young warrior drunk with fire and killing. So not drunk from alcohol, but he's just so worked up, like, yeah! And people get really pumped up. He seized him by this long white hair and dragged him, so this is Priam, backwards on the altar steps and drove his sword through the old man's body so that his lifeblood fouled the sanctuary where he had so often made offerings to the gods. So some random soldier just killed King Priam. And they bound the royal women despite all their screams and struggling and dragged them captive away. So then maybe they tied their hands up with rope. This is intense. All through the city was fire and killing and the crashing down of walls and roofs as, after 10 years' siege or attack, mighty Troy was put to the sword. But Helen had not been with the rest of the royal women, and Menelaus had gone striding off through the palace courts where rags of burning timbers fell from the sky, seeking the house of Deiphobus, for he guessed that, with no other of the king's sons still living, that was where she would be. He knew when he had found the right house, for in the entrance he came upon Deiphobus lying sprawled in his armor, the spear that had killed him standing upright in his breast. A chain of crimson footprints that started in the pool of his blood led on through the portico and into the darkness of the hall beyond. Let me show you this image. Menelaus followed them like a hound on the scent, and so found Odysseus, leaning as though weary against one of the central pillars of the great chamber with the light of burning roofs glinting through the high window upon his armor, and a trickle of his own blood oozing darkly out from his sleeve. "Where is Helen?" Menelaus demanded, staring in the doorway, his sword out in his hand. "If you are hiding her..." Odysseus raised his head. "Earlier today, you swore to give me the thing that I asked for, whatever it might be." "Ask then, and the thing is yours," Menelaus said. "I am not an oath breaker, though now is surely not the time." So he's like, listen, I don't break promises, but come on, do we have to do this now? Odysseus said, I ask for the life of Helen of the fair cheeks, that I may give it back to her in payment for my own life, which she saved for me when I came here seeking the luck of Troy. There was a long stillness in the great chamber, a hollow stillness amid all the outcry of the sacked city beyond the walls. Then Helen, with her pale robes gathered close about her, stole from the dark corner where she had been hiding. She fell at her lord's feet, so she fell down at Menelaus' feet. Her golden hair outflung all about her and reached her hands beseechingly to touch his knees, with no word spoken. Menelaus stood looking down at her, remembering that she had betrayed him to go with Paris and left his hearth or his home desolate and his child without a mother. And if it had not been for his promise to Odysseus, he would have slain her in that moment. So Menelaus would have literally killed Helen right then and there if Odysseus hadn't said, this was your promise and this is what I want, to protect her. But he had made the promise, and because of it, he held back. As he still stood looking down at her, he began to remember other things from the time that they had shared together before Paris came. Pity and love stirred again in his heart. His drawn sword slipped from his grasp and fell ringing upon the pavement. He stooped and gathered her up, and her white arms were round his neck even as he coughed in the smoke of burning Troy. So I wonder, just a quick question, would you have taken Helen back at that point? Or if you were Helen, would you have gone back with Menelaus? When dawn came, Troy lay in ashes, the temple of Athena and the great horse with all the rest. The gold and silver, the ivory and amber were being shared among the Greek war hosts. Priam lay dead before his household altar. The scorched bodies of his slain, the burnt bodies of the killed warriors, lay piled in the fallen streets, waiting for the dogs and the birds of prey to come and eat at them. And the women were being herded to the ships of their new masters. I'm going to show you this image. Hector's baby son lay dead beneath the ramparts from which he had been thrown in the fighting, as Andromache was thrust aboard the ship of a new prince of the Myrmidons. Princess Cassandra was carried to the great ship of Agamemnon himself. Only Helen, who, after discord with her golden apple, that was that woman who threw that apple down, had been the cause of it all, was led with honor as a queen and not a slave to the ship of her husband Menelaus. The long siege was over, and in the young light of morning the ships of the great fleet were run down into the shallows. The rowers sprang aboard and took up their oars, and leaving the boat strand empty save for the shorebirds crying and the smoke of Troy still rising behind them, they set their prows toward the home beaches that they had left so many years ago. And that is the end of the Iliad by Homer. Or as you guys might have remembered, Black Ships Before Troy by Rosemary Sutcliffe. So it's like a children's version that we've been reading. So that's been a lot. We have gone through a lot over the last, weeks, maybe even months. I'd have to look back and see how long we've been reading for. So here's a question for you overall, the whole thing. What were some of the highlights for you? What did you enjoy most in the story? So what were some moments for you? And then what were some moments that maybe some lowlights, like you thought, I don't like this too much. Like we just saw right there, like Hector's baby was tossed over and killed. Like for me personally, that's kind of tough to even take in this last chapter. So those two questions for you. Now a face, let's think. What shall we do with the last face? Why don't we do our own face at the end of this chapter? Like what are you thinking inside after this the end of the chapter and the whole book? So here's mine. I'm happy it's over in one way because the war is over. I'm a little bit sad in another because Troy just got wrecked. I mean, basically everybody's killed and the women are taken off as slaves. So it's a weird thing to think of today because that's just not the way things happen. Even during wars, it's not like you take the other side and make slaves of them, right? So slavery is basically eliminated through all of the world, although it still does exist in some places, in some small areas. But back then, slavery was normal. It's kind of incredible to think about. So we've got a battle, and in some ways, it seems like nobody really won. You know, so much death, so much enslavement, women without their babies, fathers without their babies. It's just not fun all over. But then we had some heroic times throughout. No doubt some great battling and some courage and some honor and bravery. But in the end, we've just got a lot of dead people. I mean, that's kind of sad to think about it like that, but that's what it seems like, at least to me. So that's on a larger note. I think that's my larger down. On my larger bright note, on the overall book, it's great to look up, for me, to look up to some of these guys who at some points throughout the book had such courage and they went out there and fought for at least what they thought was right. So I thought, for me personally, that's kind of cool. And one of my heroes in this book is Diomedes and the real Iliad. So maybe when you're older, or if you're a parent out there or a teacher or whoever you are, reading the original Iliad is quite a trip. It's a lot of fun. It's a very difficult read. There's so many names in it and so many places. So I actually really like this children's version of it. But if you ever want to, I recommend going through the whole thing, the whole Iliad by Homer. It's actually the Iliad and the Odyssey. So there's two basic parts to this larger story that you can check out. Cool? Well, that's it. I hope you guys have enjoyed. I know some of you have not stuck on the whole route, but for those of you who are out there who made it through this whole journey, awesome to you. I'm doing like this. I don't know why, but anyhow, adios and take care, everyone.